I'll jump in. I'm going to take Peter's point, I'm going to flip it around. He's absolutely right that the online space is not for everybody, but something that we sometimes forget is that the in-class, on-campus space is also not equally comfortable or familiar to all kinds of learners. It's familiar to us, and we tend to often think that it's the sort of gold standard, but the fact is there are a lot of people who don't thrive or succeed very well. They don't speak up very often, or they're operating in a second language, so they're not the first one to raise their hands, or they lack confidence, or whatever happens. And from their perspective, the classroom can be a very intimidating, difficult place. I think one of the big advantages of online spaces is that there can be multiple channels or pathways for interaction: voice, video, text, synchronous, asynchronous, large group, small group, one-to-one, one-to-many. And unlike a classroom, which has fairly limited communicative options, the professor's talking, the students are talking to the professor, the students are talking to each other. In an online space, you have multiple possibilities, including virtual or indirect forms of identity and interaction. And I think one of the great advantages of online courses is that you can multiply these pathways and channels instead of forcing students into the one that maybe is most comfortable to us. As long as we're flexible, students can find the spaces for interacting with you and with the material and with each other that works best for them. It doesn't have to be one size fits all.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's, for me, very interesting about online is that can happen all at once. And if you are a student who is capable of maneuvering through cacophony, you'll have your GChat open, your text messages will be going, and you're talking with a subgroup of students, or with me, because I also have those things open while I'm teaching.
Right.
And occasionally I want to herd them back to the class platform, because class starts to disperse out, and sometimes you need to bring it back in. And I think having that variety, but also I realized that one night I was communicating with students in 5 different ways in a single class, while I was also attempting to do a presentation. And I think I hit my limit at that point, and began to also understand that the students were doing that as well. So that if someone seems like their attention is wandering, it's actually not, it's just somewhere else.
Sure.
And having a conversation about whether, is that a time to flip the classroom and to send out a video of me doing a lecture, and then we'll come back and we'll look at all these different things, or have we occasionally pushed the limits of what we are capable of doing with all of these devices just because we have them close to us and we wonder how they go.
Sure.
And I think what I like about that situation was it was a moment where the class could stop and discuss why they were doing each one of the things, what each one of the devices offered in terms of a genre of learning, and maybe decide to do it sequentially rather than simultaneously. Yeah.
I think too, in addition to differences in the way people like to access their course materials, because of the breadth, oftentimes we're able to have students in our classes from multiple places, multiple countries, multiple time zones, and even just the geographic difference. So a student in the West Coast, East Coast, and the Midwest, all in the class together, they just bring a very, very different perspective that helps remind us that, oh yes, in schools where I live, this is how it is, because we forget. Sometimes in face-to-face, we've all kind of been in the same area, and we're pretty encapsulated. We see things that way. It also gives students, I think, a space and opportunity for those who maybe would not prefer to wrestle more challenging topics. It gives them that little bit of a buffer, so they can do it in a synchronous session. They can have discussions in a small group. They can have discussions through chat or through email, but it gives them a way to process some of these things that lets them, I guess, put that little separation between this visceral reaction, and they're able to think about and bring critical analysis to some of the issues around race and gender and sexuality that they would need to really understand, but they are reluctant to do in a face-to-face setting.
Again, from a historical perspective, in the early years of online education, online learning, it was a privileged form of accessing higher education. It required high levels of computer literacy, a fairly sophisticated laptop on your, or a PC on your desk, reliable access, with a proliferation of handheld devices, and the ease with which internet messages and internet communication is possible now, I think those barriers are declining. But they're not ubiquitous yet. Not everybody has access to reliable, fast-speed internet. I'm working on a project in Indonesia, where we can, broadcast and teach in Jakarta and the major cities, but certainly not in the outlying areas of that country. So this will improve over time, but I think access for everybody to internet and online learning modalities is not a given at this point in time.
One thing very briefly, to pick up on something that Chris said that might be useful from the standpoint of people who are doing this for the first time. One of the things about online teaching is, in my experience, you have to give up a certain desire for control that you have in a traditional class that you just can't exercise in quite the same way in an online class. And there may be that students are doing multiple forms of interaction, and let's say 5, and you can't monitor them all at the same time. It's disconcerting at first when you're in a room with everybody on their laptops open. You know they're listening to you, but you also know that they're chatting or posting to each other. The on-campus students, the online students, let's say in my dual mode classes, I know they're interacting with each other in real time, and I don't see any of that. I hope they're paying attention to me. I think they're paying attention to me, but they are operating at these multiple levels at the same time. And it's disconcerting in a way if you approach the situation with a certain desire to be, you're not saying this, but to be the one in charge of all forms of communication, and to give up the idea that there's a certain level of that. You hope they're not doing their Facebook pages or shopping online, but to give up that desire for control and to say, look, they're going to take some responsibility for themselves, for how they interact with each other, and I don't have to be in charge of that. I don't have to be monitoring that, at least not all the time. I can't monitor it all the time.
Yeah, I think I would just want to jump in because I think there are ways that online doesn't always have to, but changes the relationship between professor, subject, and student. And I think there are ways that students start to take much more responsibility for what they want from the subject. And it's not always clear, especially in talking to professors who are just starting out, that they've taken enough into account of student agency, really what it comes down to. And I do think that's a challenge in online teaching.
I agree, and it goes back to Peter's point. That's one reason why it's not for everybody.
Right.
Not all students are ready to take on that kind of responsibility.